Well, good evening, everyone. We are here tonight, the Belfast and District branch of the NUJ, and we've all got together to have a memory of Lyra for us, for our branch of the Union. And we were to have a very important speaker, lecturer, and unfortunately, Susan McKee lost her mother towards the end of last week, and she's unable to be with us tonight. So I know you will understand and join me in sending Susie our sympathy. She sends her love to all of us on such an important evening and hopes to accept an invitation to speak at next year's event. Now, whilst many in the audience knew Lyra, I didn't know this bundle of energy. However, in planning tonight's event, I've come to understand why she was, and still is, held in such high esteem and so well loved. She was named after a star, and that's what she was, a shooting star destined to climb higher and higher. And even that dreadful night in the Creggan when she was murdered hasn't stopped that ascent. Her influence, her writing, her love of honesty and equality it's become a goal for many, especially young people coming into our industry. And there are 2 or 3 young men here tonight who have decided they are going to be journalists and they're studying for that. And we welcome you boys tonight. Thanks to our guest tonight, we will learn a lot more about Lyra and about the lives and the deaths of journalists throughout the world, especially here in Northern Ireland, and the responsibilities of a journalist. I'd like to introduce the panel. NUJBelfast has been Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights since April 2018. She has focused her work on a range of human rights issues, including freedom of expression, safety of journalists, the protection of human rights defenders, the rights of migrants and refugees, and combating discrimination and hate speech. She has also worked to address the challenges faced by women, children, and vulnerable groups, particularly those affected by conflict and displacement. Also, on the human rights consequences of Russia's war in Ukraine, and now, of course, the Middle East. Prior to her appointment as Commissioner, NUJB had a number of responsibilities, including the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe representative on freedom of the media, Director of Broadcasting at Communications Regularity Agency of Bosnia and Herzegovina, Chair of the European Platform of Regularity Agencies, and of the Council of Europe's group of experts on freedom of expression and information in times of crisis. NUJB, thank you for giving us your time tonight. We welcome you, and we look forward to talking to you very shortly. Lyra came from a large and loving family. Her mother and her sister Nicola were very special to her. However, now, sadly, of the 3, only Nicola is left. But the family continued to speak out on behalf of their sister and carry on Lyra's crusade for peace, fairness, and equality, as they still live in the center of that ripple of horror. Nicola has said that Lyra's funeral was one of the first times in a number of years that all the political leaders were together in one building and promises were made. Nicola, we'll hear more about that from you in a moment. Seamus Dooley is somewhat ubiquitous. As NUJ Secretary and as Assistant General Secretary of the overall Union, he's at everyone's beck and call and never leaves without giving good sense and direction to our numbers. Seamus has been close to the McKee family, supporting them, as well as supporting many others who have lost loved ones and colleagues. We meet here tonight under the banner of the National Union of Journalists, and we're proud to be members of that historical body. Throughout the world, it's a hard time to be a journalist, as people in this audience know only too well. We have our tragedies at home with the murders of Lyra, Marty O'Hagan, and Veronica Guerin. But we continue to fight for justice for them and for what we believe is right. It's all wrong that writers and photographers and those working in the media should be the story and in the spotlight. To speak on this, the president of the NUJ, Natasha Hurst, will join us by video in London shortly. Father Martin McGill is a man of the cloth, an author, campaigner, and activist. So respected that when he was moved from his parish in Polglas to Lenadoon, youth groups protested. Such was their respect for him. He knew Lyra well, and when he stood at her funeral in St. Anne's Cathedral, he didn't mince his words. Speaking in front of a church packed with her friends and admirers, the British Prime Minister Theresa May and Michael D. Higgins, the President of Ireland, plus politicians from all walks of life, he received a standing ovation, and his words live on. I commend our political leaders for standing together in Creggan on Good Friday. I am, however, left with a question. Why, in God's name, does it take the death of a 29-year-old woman with her whole life in front of her to get to this point? Alison Miller is a BAFTA filmmaker who only last week was awarded the Prix Europa for the Best Documentary. Alison will discuss this documentary, Lyra, charting the life and untimely death of the young woman who had been her friend since Lyra was 16. Alison, it must have been a very difficult film to make, and we'll see in two short clips featuring Lyra's growing up and the dreadful night when she was murdered. Alison, would you like to introduce them?
Thank you very much. I'm really very honoured to be asked to speak tonight. And as Nicola and I and all our family here know, we take every opportunity to speak about our girl. So thank you so much, Seamus and everyone. I first met Lyra when she was 16. I was making a documentary in the Rape Crisis Centre in Belfast. And there was this young girl kept getting in the way of my shot when I was filming. And then she sort of said, so what are you doing? And I sort of said, well, what are you doing? Are you on a school placement, in a rather patronising way? And she said, no, I'm the Sky Young Journalist of the Year. And I'm trying to understand why this centre is being closed down. I'm investigating it. And she was. And we became friends from that moment on. I never, ever spoke up again. I was like, yes, Lyra, okay, Lyra. So this film began, I suppose, after that dreadful night. I think when I moved into your mummy's house, I think we spent time together before the funeral, and people were already writing to Nicola and the family and talking about making a documentary, and it was just far too early, and we were all just so raw about it. And then a few weeks later, you and your mummy were going to London, and we decided to film this. Possibly for our campaign or something. And then eventually it was discussed about making a film. And I have to say it was certainly Nicola, the family here, and Sarah, who said, if anybody's going to make it, it must be you. So we did embark on that journey. We had an awful lot of support from the entire community here on the way. So the first clip I'm going to show you is a clip which happened when we made the film together, all of us. There were no surprises. I arrived up at your house with a clip and a voice that we'd found, and I laid it down and said, I think Lyra can narrate her own story. And I played it to you and John, and we cried, and then we went, yes, let's do it. So this clip is to show how we found her dictaphone tapes and decided to let Lyra tell her story. It's her growing up. Move, everyone.
A Catholic man has been shot dead tonight in North Belfast. The attack happened in the Ardoyne area of the city.
He was shot dead in a part of Belfast where a fifth of all those who have died in Northern Ireland's Troubles have been killed.
I grew up in Ardoyne, a Republican community in North Belfast in the 90s, on the Cliftonville Road. The people were mostly decent people, but it was a tough, tough place. Cliftonville Road was just off a place called Murder Mile. That was the nickname. In fact, he says more casualties there per square mile than any part of Northern Ireland during the conflict. But like, I remember things as a child, like, you know, just be careful when you're walking to school. Okay, there's a suspect device on Rose Penna. I often tell Americans that if you've seen images of Belfast on fire in the 90s, you were probably seeing Ardoyne.
Northern Ireland has seized the chance of a new beginning. That's the outcome of the historic agreement reached this evening at the Stormont peace talks.
This is for the fucking scum paramilitaries that run this fucking country.
The violence, which has been part of life in Northern Ireland for nearly 30 years, may be over permanently following last week's peace deal.
After a 30-year winter of sectarian violence, Northern Ireland today has the promise of a springtime of peace.
Today is Good Friday, and I think for the people of Northern Ireland, it will be a very Good Friday.
Yes, 71.12%.
71% of people in the north and 94% of the south said yes to the Good Friday Agreement, which aims to bring peace in Northern Ireland.
108 members of the new Northern Ireland Assembly have taken their seats in the Stormont Parliament building.
Enemies across 3 decades now face each other across the floor of their own political forum.
It's up to the local politicians to make this peace agreement work.
Okay, it's kind of interesting, actually, even every time I watch that clip, I actually think to myself, it's up to the local politicians to make this peace agreement work. Did I say that? I watched that clip time and time again. I think the interesting thing was when we decided that we found the dictaphone tapes and we were going to lay them down and allow Lyra to tell her story. I think there were so many wonderful things that we discovered during that process. Number one, as Nicola and John will say, obviously her sources weren't labelled, so the stuff that we were going through, we had no idea who anyone was, including panting dogs and some man who kept going, "Ah, you're right," the whole time, so we didn't know who it was. We had to go back and try and work out who the people were and find them and get their help. And every single person, this is a mark of how amazing Lyra McKee was, every single person that we found that Nicola approached and said, "We'd like to use your voice to tell this story in the film," loved Lyra. There was no one said no to me because she knocked on that front door, entered their home, told the story with integrity, left, and kept a relationship that was so incredibly wonderful with every single person that I connected with over a long pile of the research in this. Anyway, so after that, I think we put them together and we decided that the important thing was really to grow her up. And she was surrounded by incredibly strong women, just as you said, a wonderful mother, late Mother Joan, sister and family. And it was a real joy for me and my team, who are very female as well. Wonderful editor Chloe, wonderful assistant Orla, whole team of incredible women to work with, incredible pile of women to tell this young woman's story. And the issues that she brought up, as we discovered, were about LGBTQ plus issues, suicide, a massive project that she'd been working on since the age of 16. When she won the Sky Young Journalist Award, she was never going to let these subjects go, and about intergenerational trauma and how that was connected. Lyra had a real strong belief that a story could be at the end of your street. She was a great believer in local stories, local voices that had a universal language, themes that were universal to all of us: home, health, poverty, relationships. She had so many things that she saw, and I think that she is always will feel for me and be for me a great inspiration for someone who looks for a story that is at the end of the street. So those people's voices do matter and can be a global, can affect, and travel globally. They really can be universal, those themes are, because that's how some of the best stories are told. So I think the second clip that I really wanted to show tonight, well, I say I want to show, I hate showing it, I hate it in a way, because for all of us it's horrible. It's the night that she was killed, and I think I just want to show it tonight because I think it's important that we think of the work and the people, the work we do and why we do it, and think of Lyra. So the second clip is from that night in the Creggan at the beginning of the film. Okay.
With a bike, move back down the street.
We drove up and the streets were really jammed because everybody was up to watch the riot. There were loads of people, lots of kids, journalists. We were only there for 8 minutes from start to finish. We were sort of at the back end of the last set of 2 Land Rovers. Lyra had gone into journalist mode, so she was like taking pictures and she was typing on her phone, and we didn't really talk very much. And then I was like, right, we'll move back up a wee bit, because there was stuff on fire and they were throwing petrol bombs and stones. We'd moved further back and the crowd started getting really agitated and like, yeah. I turned to Lyra to say, let's move up further because I think they're going to rush towards the Land Rovers, and she wasn't there. She was on the ground. We dropped down and then I noticed the wound on her head. police took her into the back of the Land Rover. I was like, can I come with you? And they were like, listen, there's not enough room. They literally tore off and went straight through the burning car and flew. And I was kind of just standing there, like, I had her phone in my hand because I'd lifted it from the ground where she dropped it. And I was just covered, my hands were covered in her blood, and I didn't know what to do.
Thank you. I think from when I was putting the film together, myself and my team, we knew that this was the entrance point to the story and that the world knew of this killing of this young woman in this place, Derry, County Derry, London Derry, whatever, anyway, you know, in Northern Ireland. But they didn't know who she was more than that. Some people did, of course, because she'd already made a huge mark in her career with Faber and Faber book deal, 2-book deal with, you know, Forbes 30 under 30. She was already an incredibly accomplished writer. But I think we decided to put that at the top of the film as the point where we believed that the world was also coming into the story. So actually the first clip I showed you was when I took you right back then, and we grew her up here in, off the Cliftonville Road with her family. So I think, you know, it was important when we were doing that to use her words and her voice throughout the film. And I think for those of you who've seen the film probably know that then there's a second point where we come right round in the story to the night again, and Nicola talks about what happened and how they discovered the news. It's been a very emotional journey for all of us making this film, but once we set off on that journey, there is a sort of quote about failure not being an option. So we decided that we were going to make really sure we were going to get her words and her voice and her story out there, because actually what we've discovered, the film's been in, I think, about 16 countries now, from India to Australia. It's in Perth at the minute. It's been in Poland. It's been watched in Italian, Spanish, Polish. It's in Slovakia in a few weeks' time. And of all the places the film has been, we've had so many standing ovations for Lyra, because young people take away her message of hope. They connect with her. They see that she was trying to give people a voice. You know, Janet up the road, she talked about the past and cared a lot about helping people tell their story, no matter where they came from, no matter what side of the wall, floor, it didn't matter. She was the most compassionate and caring human being with a real hunger to tell a story. So before I show my last clip, which I wanted to read something that I was thinking about, because there's so many things to talk about Lyra, but one of the things is always best to go back to her words. When we were editing, we had a book of everything. I had all her transcripts and things. She used to send you stuff half-written saying, do you think it's any good? And it wasn't that it wasn't any good, it was amazing. And we had spent our life together persuading each other that you can do this. And I'd go, no, I can't, I have no idea. And then I would say, no, you can do this. So now I've got Nicola shouting at me, you can do this all the time, because I'm bouncing back off her in the same way, because that's what we did. So this little clip, I'd like to read out of the book. Put my glasses on. This is a Lyra, which I love. Growing up, you felt like you got screwed over, that there was a lot of injustice. So now, whenever you see injustice, you try and fix it. You're kind of like Robin Hood without the tights, except you can't fire a bow and arrow for shit. For me, reporting for the sake of reporting is not enough. It must lead to a greater outcome than publication of the story. Figuring out what motivates you is key to becoming a good investigative reporter. 90% of investigative reporting is staying up late to make that extra phone call. You'll only work that hard for a story if it matters to you. I read that all the time. That and brick walls aren't meant to keep you out. They're meant to see how badly you want it. Another one of hers, which I'll never forget. The last clip is important to all of us, and it also kind of relates to one of my great speakers tonight in the panel. So if you don't mind, Alan, showing that, thank you very much.
Then I open up and see the person falling here is me, a different way to be.
I couldn't believe it when I heard the news on Good Friday morning that Lyra McKee had been shot dead. The irony could not be more poignant when we consider the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, which was about ensuring there would be no more deaths like Lyra's. And so, we don't need any more innocent blood to be shed. Many of us will be praying that Lyra's death, in its own way, will not have been in vain and will contribute in some way to building peace here. I am, however, left with a question. Why, in God's name, does it take the death of a 29-year-old woman with her whole life in front of her
That is very, very difficult to watch for all of us, especially for the family. But Alison, you have treated it with such care and consideration. And going into Lyra's scrapbooks and her phone messages and compiling this film has been a work of love. Now we turn to Madam Commissioner. Commissioner, Lyra had a passion for equality and for human rights. These are your passions also. Perhaps you would talk to us about your work and your thinking.
Thank you. First of all, for having this opportunity to share thoughts in memory, Lyra. I'm really sorry I cannot be with you tonight, but I can only say that even in cyberspace, love is felt and the emotions coming from the place where you are marking this amazing woman. I also never had the opportunity to meet Lyra in person, but I already think that we somehow met somewhere and that we know each other. And it is actually based on my talks with her family and reading her books and trying to find out more about her life. And the work she did and everything she said and she wrote, and of course, you know, we celebrate her as a journalist. But I would also say that she was a fierce and courageous human rights defender. She was defending women's rights. And in this, she was absolutely amazing. Last year, in June, I visited Belfast to carry out human rights work about the legacy of the past, but also the situation related to journalists and journalist safety. And naturally, this particular visit also focused on Lyra's case because she killed 3 years earlier, and the wait for justice to be delivered was then, as it is now, continuing. I managed to talk, and I'm really honored with this possibility with the Lyra sisters, Nicola and Mary. And I also spoke to Sarah online at that time, and also this year in April, I met her at the screening of this extraordinary documentary in Strasbourg. Alison Miller did, and I pay tribute to the efforts of Lyra's family, partner and friends to keep her memory alive. But I also say that it is not the responsibility of a grieving family and friends to serve justice. It is the state who needs to deliver justice. And this is so often the case in many member states of the Council of Europe, but also beyond. It is not just about Lyra as a person, but especially also what she stood for through her work. And as a human rights person, I often see media outputs that are focused on polarization, on fault lines in society, focusing on conflict, on scapegoating certain groups. And unfortunately, we see lots of this also in the UK these days. For example, when it comes to reporting about refugees or about LGBTI persons, which is creating an increasingly toxic atmosphere. And from this perspective, Lyra's work focused on understanding, on being compassionate, giving a voice to people who may otherwise not be heard was so important. I talk about her when I have lectures and when I meet journalists. I have, in my mind her smile, but this smile that is so full of courage and knowledge and a way, focusing and seeing, what is at stake if we keep and remain silent in our societies. And we need more of this, not only in Northern Ireland, the UK and Europe widely. Lyra, in a way, showed us, and especially young people, that another way of doing things is possible. And I hope that from deep sadness of her death comes inspiration to others to follow in her footsteps. I do not say this because it's just something that we should be saying. I deeply feel this need for all of us to continue doing everything we can, all in our own sort of expertise, not to forget about all these things that she was saying. And there are so many other colleagues and people and families that I'm meeting all the time in a very similar situation. And I focus specifically on the situation of young people in Northern Ireland when I was there. Also, people who were born after the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, but who still face, as they told me, intimidation, abuse, exploitation by paramilitary groups, and continue to live in a deeply, deeply divided society, including a deeply segregated education system. You know that I come from Sarajevo, from Bosnia and Herzegovina, that shares, unfortunately, very similar destiny as the Northern Ireland when it comes to situation with young generations and with youth. And many are also at risk of carrying the generational trauma, the troubles, which is further fueled with closing avenues to justice. So the fight of Lyra's loved ones is, of course, not only to keep her memory alive, it also continues to be a fight for justice. And I have said before, there cannot and must not be an impunity. And I'm following closely how Lyra's case is progressing and keep impressing on the authorities the importance to ensure that those responsible are brought to justice. And this is absolutely crucial for Lyra's loved ones, but for society more generally. And if a culture of impunity is allowed to develop, as you know, this has a profound impact on journalism. It may lead to self-censorship, or journalists leaving the profession, which is also happening quite often. So unfortunately, alongside Lyra's loved ones, we still see many other families of journalists waiting for justice. And during my visit, I met with Martin O'Hannon's brother. Throughout my work, I have engaged also with the cases of Daphne Caruanas Galizia in Malta and also Jan Kuciak in Slovakia. And since Lyra's death, 23 more journalists were killed in Europe, according to the Committee on the Protection of Journalists, both in conflict, such as Ukraine, and in the line of their reporting, for example, on crime and corruption. These deaths are just, I would say, a tip of the iceberg of threats to journalism, and many more are faced with violence, harassment, legal procedures to prevent them from doing their work, and other problems. The Council of Europe promote and protection of journalism and safety of journalists received more than 150 alerts of physical attacks and intimidation in member states. So we are not learning on mistakes. The governments, the states are still not taking this seriously. And I think it is absolutely extremely important to say that in this respect, Northern Ireland is post-conflict setting where there are still deep social scars, but also I apologize. It's a terrible flu. So identifying and prosecuting those who make threats must be the highest priority of the authorities. So I can only say that I will continue this fight here and across Europe. And I will use my mandate to give a voice to those whose voices are unheard. And unfortunately, there are too many. And in this respect, as I said, I take this enormous inspiration from Lyra, and I take hope as well. This event that her legacy will live on among those here present, future generations of journalists and human rights activists. And I really do hope that soon I will also be able to meet many of you in person in order to plan other events and everything to do with keeping the memory of this extraordinary woman alive and keeping just the way she was and the way we should remember her.
Dunja, thank you so very much. It's been a fascinating insight into your work, and you've certainly thrown out some challenges to us. Thank you. Nicola, would you like to come up onto the stage again? You've traveled the world with Alison, always looking for justice for your sister, who is a remarkable woman. You know that, and we now know that.
She absolutely like everyone, Lyra deserves justice, and there isn't anywhere we wouldn't go to try and continue to share her story and to keep searching for justice. It's very, very important to us. I don't think for any member of my family, because, you know, Lyra was Mummy's baby. Mummy had 6 children, and Lyra was the baby of the 6 children, and Mummy got me to represent her after Lyra was killed, and now I represent the family and Lyra. So me and my other siblings, I mean, the main thing that we want and our own families want is for Lyra to have justice, and so that Lyra is not not forgotten ever as well. And events like this are really important, we feel, because it keeps Lyra in the hearts and minds of people. She can't be forgotten about, and her desire and need for justice can't be forgotten about. And we're just so grateful that Dunja has taken up on board support for Lyra's case and for the case of other journalists, because it's great to have people in a position of influence who can actually perhaps push things in the right direction for all of us, because my 2 brothers, my 2 sisters, all of our families, we need help. We can't do that on our own. As she said, it shouldn't be up to families to be pursuing truth and justice for their loved ones. And very sadly, in Northern Ireland, that is the case. There's a representative here from SEF, and he will tell you those stories. Families are really the people having to pursue justice for their loved ones. And it shouldn't be like that. We all need people to support families to get truth and justice.
What reaction are you getting as you travel around the world?
A lot of the times people, when they, especially when we show it, some of the film, or all of the film in fact, no matter where you show it, whether it's in England or the Republic of Ireland or an international country or in Europe or wherever, people can't believe the scenes that they see taking place in Northern Ireland. For a lot of people, this film is actually the first time that they get to be exposed to the kinds of things that happened here. And so they're shocked by that, but everyone that we meet falls in love with Lyra. They feel like they know her through the film, and they feel like, you know, she becomes a person who matters to them because her voice carries them through the film. They come to love her and they lose her, even though they've never met her in their whole entire life. We've had people who have watched the film, who have composed songs in honor of Lyra. We have
including Christy Moore.
Including Christy Moore, yeah. And people have just been so moved and touched by her because she was an extraordinary person who really, you know, she spent her life serving others, and I think it's time that we all serve her.
When you were sitting at home with her, I mean, what was she like? What was her great attribute? I mean, apart from what we know of her, you saw her as a little girl growing up.
She was very, very generous. She was always a very generous person, even as a youngster. Do you know, I remember when the terrible Boxing Day tsunami took place, she had been previously saving up some money so that she could go and buy a book. And my mum took her into town to buy this book she'd been saving up for, and they walked past St. Anne's Cathedral, who were doing a charity drive for the survivors in the tsunami case. And Lyra donated all of her money. And my mummy said, I thought you wanted to buy a book. And she says, I can get a book later. These people need that money more than me. And Lyra didn't have a lot. You saw where we were, how we grew up, single parent family, on benefits, mother was disabled. And so it was a big thing for her even to be able to save up to buy a book, so then to give that away to other people. But that's what she was like, and she never changed. She was always generous, I would say often to a fault, and she would do anything for anyone if they needed it. But she was also really funny. She was funny because even though she was really smart and intelligent and all of these things, sometimes she was just really silly. And my sister, Mary, who's here, she'll tell you the story of my mum being away. And so Lyra had to clean up the house because Lyra lived with our mum. And she asked Mary where the dishwasher was. And it wasn't the dishwasher, it was a washing machine. And there hadn't been a dishwasher in that house at all. And it gave us all like such a huge laugh, but it was the kind of thing Lyra was about. You know, we tried. My mummy made little videos that I still have on Lyra's iPad, showing her how to use a microwave. Do you know, so while she could write these great stories and get published on front pages of newspapers and talk to people at universities around the world and train other journalists in digital media. She couldn't use an iron, you know. She's really funny.
She was a woman who was obviously happy in her own skin.
Oh, yeah.
But where do you stand now with your work getting justice for Lyra?
Well, right now, we're awaiting a trial. So the gunman who killed Lyra is still evading justice, continues to evade justice. There's just not enough evidence to charge that person, although the police know who it is. There have been 3 individuals charged with murder joint enterprise, which means that the gunman couldn't have done what he did and gotten away with what he did without their help. And their trial begins on the 8th of April. So that's 10 days before Lyra's 5th anniversary. And so we just have to wait and see how that goes.
Do all the, the walks, the concerts, events like this, does that help you?
That's a really hard question because, you know, I think that it helps us to make sure that Lyra is not forgotten. It's very difficult for us to come to events, even though we are really heartwarmed that people want to do things for Lyra and want to remember her and invite us to take part in those events. But it's really difficult to do because, you know, I've travelled with the film. I've probably seen it about 30 times or more. And every time I see it, you know, we get Lyra back and then we lose her, and we get her back and we lose her, and we get her back and we lose her. And it's really hard to believe still that she's not going to come bouncing in that door or any door. You still expect somehow that maybe at the end of an event, someone's going to like pull back some kind of magic curtain and in will walk Lyra, and it will only have all been just a terrible nightmare. And then that doesn't happen. Do you know? I was in Boston recently, speaking about Lyra. And on the first day, when we were walking around Boston at 6:30 in the morning, I was looking around at people almost expecting her to be among them. Do you know that somehow by going to another country, she would turn up again and it won't have happened? Do you know?
On the other hand, have events like this, excuse me, helped pressurize the authorities into doing something more quickly or getting to the bottom of this and achieving justice?
Well, I would hope so, although probably in all likelihood they don't really pay that much attention to what we're doing, you know. I would like to think that sometimes they do, but I mean,
who knows?
The police are doing what the police are doing, and that's taking its time and what have you. But the people that have the information and perhaps even the evidence that could bring a gunman to justice, you know, for all the sympathies and we're sorries and we're ashamed it happened in our city, they're still concealing a murderer, in my view. And we were certainly hoping when the film went into people's living rooms that maybe they watched it with their curtains closed and saw it and maybe felt something. But it doesn't appear to have had that effect so far. But it's had a different effect, which is something that we're very pleased about, and that is that Lyra is remembered, because not only is today the eve of the impunity against journalism, it's also the eve of El Dia de los Muertos in Mexico, and the Mexicans believe that as long as their loved ones are remembered and honoured, that their souls will live on forever. And so I believe that that's true, that after we're all gone, maybe even with her, that she'll still be remembered by some people somewhere. Maybe little Gabriel from Italy who fell in love with her at the age of 12 and continues to follow her work. And she'll be remembered, hopefully, forever.
I think there's no doubt about that. Thank you very much indeed, Nicola. We're going to hear from Seamus next, but just beforehand, I'd like to tell you a story, because words matter in our trade and our industry, and they can change the course of history, as I discovered very recently. I was in Donegal in September, and we were in Ardra, and there was something going on in the corner house. So we went in, and it was a mock wake for the cruise ships and the Americans coming in. They would sit round. Mary would show them how to make soda bread. Then Mick came running in and said, "Oh, it's awful, it's awful. Michael's dead, he's lying in the back here. You're in a wake house now. Come and show your respects." All the Americans go up and show respect. And one woman was a nurse, and she said, "Oh, I'll take his pulse." But the man said, no, I don't think he'd take his pulse. Not there. He said, "If you go further down, you might get a reaction." And poor old Michael, who was lying in the coffin, couldn't suppress a smile at all. Michael worked in the shop further up the road, and he was the corpse every single time. And sometimes it was 4 times a day. However, I wrote a story about it, and the corner house were very pleased. They had it laminated, and it was up on the walls. And RTE came up last week to do a program, a quiz program. And they saw the article, and they were entranced by the story. They insisted on having the wake put up, and they filmed it. And instead of a quiz, this program about Ardra, about the corner house, is being shown tomorrow night on RTE. So you can change the course of the world, or the programming for RTE anyway. But Seamus, journalists have a huge responsibility to their public, and sometimes they give their lives for their work. And you have the unique distinction of knowing all 3 of our fellow journalists who died or were murdered here in Ireland.
Yeah, and I suppose the first thing I'd say is that I have sort of scripted myself, because coming after Nicola, I thought it was the safest thing to do, and particularly looking at that film, and there are some things I want to say. The first thing I'd say is that that's an unwanted distinction of knowing the 3 journalists killed in the line of duty. I worked in Independent House with Veronica Guerin. I was a union activist with Martin O'Hagan, and I'd met Lyra a few brief occasions, 2 brief, at branch meetings in Derry and Belfast. And I hope no one will take offence that she stood out because of the age profile of the branch. She reduced the age profile of Belfast branch by about 200%. In this audience, it will be a temerity for me to praise Lyra or to list her qualities. I don't have to. But I do want to make a few comments. I'm very mindful of the importance that we don't define Veronica Guerin, Martin O'Hagan or Lyra by the circumstances of their untimely death. None of them sought the crown of martyrdom. They didn't give their lives to press freedom. It was stolen from them, savagely stolen from them. And I remember at a function where Veronica Guerin's mother Bernie spoke very tellingly, and she made that point that she normally said silent in tribute, but someone said that Veronica gave her life to freedom, and Bernie said, no, she didn't. It was snatched from her. And I know that Joan felt the same. And tonight, in remembering Susan McKee and her mother, the one person who would definitely understand Susan's reason for not being here was Nicola, because Nicola was so devoted to Joan. It's also worth remembering, I think, or recalling that Veronica was killed 2 days before she was due to speak at a function very similar to this, a press freedom conference on the theme Dying to Tell the Story, Journalists at Risk. And I recall ringing the conference organisers. I was in the Indo at the time. I was a chapel officer, and it was my function. And it's the phone call that every conference organiser dreads, that someone is going to cancel. And there was a sort of the notion of a bit of a nuisance, and then you said, she's been killed. And I just remember that. It's also, I think, important, Anne, tonight to echo the call that we made earlier this year for the British and Irish governments to agree on the appointment of an international figure to investigate the murder of Martin O'Hagan. And it is an outrage that has not happened, and that there is this complicity, this shroud of silence around the O'Hagan murder. And I know that that's something that Lyra felt very strongly about. If you don't mind, I want to take you back to the eve of Lyra's funeral, when we in Dublin decided we needed to do something which would mark the death and allow people who couldn't travel to Belfast. And how do you capture the spirit of someone like that? And we picked a few elements, and one was Gloria, the gay and lesbian choir, standing, singing. The first time, I think, the 6-1 News featured Gloria singing Somewhere Over the Rainbow. But that's not the standout moment. For me, poignantly, the moment was Nola Brady from Kerry singing Paul Brady's powerful island anthem, The Island. Don't worry, I'm not going to sing it. They say the skies of Lebanon are burning, those mighty cedars bleeding in the heat. They're showing pictures on the television. Women and children dying in the streets. And we're still at it in our own place, still trying to read the future to the past, still trying to carve tomorrow from a tombstone. Women and children dying in the streets. Tonight, as we gather to celebrate the life and legacy of Lyra, our thoughts turn to another land where cedars bleed, where hearts are broken and lives are shattered. And Lyra would be the first person to ask us to remember tonight the nightmare unfolding in Palestine, a nightmare which is an affront to the principles of international law on this, the eve of International Day to End Impunity for Crime Against Journalists. And it is important that we join with all of those who seek to end the inhumane treatment of civilians and to respect the fundamental principles of the Geneva Convention and protocols. The horrendous attack launched by Hamas and its allies on the 17th of October targeted individuals and in some cases subjected them to the acts of grotesque violence. In condemning the actions of Hamas, the NUJ has condemned the actions of Israel in targeting densely populated areas, the destruction of residential buildings, the killing of civilians, and the displacement of thousands of families. If global solidarity means anything, it means defending the core values which underpin international law. And I'm deeply conscious tonight of the pain and suffering of so many men, women and children wiped out as collateral damage in a conflict not of their making. Tonight, in seeking to highlight the need to protect journalists, I do want to say that I'm in no way minimising the suffering of those trapped in the siege of Gaza or those who suffered at the hands of Hamas. All human beings share the same colour blood, regardless of race, religion, ethnic origin or profession. And we know in Northern Ireland that blood was neither orange nor green, and that blood is the same no matter what your religion. The focus of the campaign to end impunity for crimes against journalists is deeply rooted in international humanitarian law. And I think it's worth reminding ourselves that Article 17 of the Geneva Convention says journalists in war zones must be treated as civilians and protected as such, provided they play no part in hostilities. It's also worth pointing out that in international law, media facilities, offices, studios, cameras, they are civilian objects and enjoy general protection. The prohibition on attacking civilian objects applies to journalists, and that was confirmed as a war crime in protocols on the creation of the International Criminal Court. And it was really disturbing last Friday to read Israel's announcement that they could not guarantee the safety of journalists in the Gaza Strip. That's not a luxury that they have a right to. And I think we have to be unapologetic in attacking the Israeli government on that position. There's far too much whataboutery in the debate, which is that if you stand up for a human right on one side, you're expected to enter a caveat on the other. We know that international law is there and international law should be honoured. It is vital that independent journalists are facilitated in covering the war so that the stories may be told. And just a few reminders. As of yesterday, 30 journalists had been killed in the current conflict. 25 Palestinian, 4 Israelis, 1 Lebanese. The NUJ has a long and proud record of supporting Palestinian journalists, and this year my colleague, the General Secretary, Michelle Stanislavski, visited Ramallah, was interrogated at length by the Israeli security forces on the way back, and rang me to record the fact that she was at the airport and being questioned at the time. We work very closely on a number of issues, and I can talk about that later. The work is very often practical. The distribution last week of phone chargers to journalists in Gaza. Our work has centred on supports, on legal supports. And yet we have to be careful because we also represent journalists who present the story objectively in as far as they can and in a manner which is frequently framed by the difficult circumstances in which they operate. Across the globe, journalism has become a dangerous profession. 86 journalists were killed last year. That's amounting to 1 every 4 days, up from 55 killings in 2021. Every one of those journalists were killed because, like Lyra, they were doing their job. The job involves challenges, asking awkward questions. But I think above all, 2 things that Lyra was good at, and what every good journalist is, listening and looking for the stories behind the stories, the people behind the stories. And when we turn on our televisions or radios or look online at news over the last couple of days, it's very easy to get lost in the fog of the politics and of the recriminatory comments on both sides. But we know from experience on this island that there are people and there are families, who has been said earlier tonight, who should not have to, in the future, defend or campaign for what is right. Lyra understood history, but she also had that steely determination that her generation should not be the prisoners of the past. And in looking back at the film and also in reading her work, I'm always reminded, and this might surprise her, of the work of Louis MacNeice. And I think there was something of the spirit of MacNeice in her work. And I thought that it wouldn't be a bad thing to reflect on that spirit with lines from MacNeice. I hate your grandiose airs, your sob stuff, your laugh and your swagger, your assumption that everyone cares who is king of your castle. Castles are out of date. The tide flows round the children's sandy fancy. Put up what flag you like. It is too late to save your soul with bunting. Long may Lyra's spirit live. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, we now turn to Natasha Hurst, President of the NUJ, who sent us this message for tonight's event.
Thank you so much for the invitation to take part, and I'm really sorry that I can't be with you in person this evening. Thank you to everybody who's been involved with organising this remembrance event. Although sadly it's a recognition of the fact that we have lost some wonderful colleagues, some incredible journalists who made a great impact through their work. And they all still had an awful lot more to give. And that's a terrible loss for everybody. And these are awful personal tragedies for those who are close to them, their friends and family and colleagues, but also for the wider world who benefited from their journalism, from their perspectives, and the ability to reflect on and tell stories about important issues that matter to people. And they were able to change lives in the course of doing their work as well. Unfortunately, globally, the safety of journalists has been a serious concern for us for a long time. The NUJ has been very active in campaigning for our whole history, but certainly, in recent decades, in partnership with the IFJ, the EFJ, and other unions around the world, to try to protect the safety of journalists and raise awareness and lobby governments about this. And we've seen these concerns very starkly in recent days in Palestine and Israel, where we've witnessed the unbearable loss of life, including the loss of far too many journalists. And let's not forget Ukraine and Afghanistan and so many other areas of the world where conflict and corruption continues to endanger so many lives. But I think, unfortunately, people forget that here, domestically, in the UK and Ireland, safety of journalists is still a real concern for us. The threat hasn't gone away. Lyra's murder was a very recent one. An incredibly talented young journalist in what was thought to be a safer world, but we were all brutally reminded that we can never be complacent about that. And we all know that the murder of journalists has a chilling effect. It silences those voices that are exposing wrongdoing, and it has lasting repercussions for the work that all of us do. When I visited Dublin a few weeks ago, Seamus took me to the Veronica Gearan Memorial Gardens in the ground of Dublin Castle, which was very moving. And the inscription on the statue says, "Be not afraid." And it's a powerful one that speaks to the incredible courage of journalists who pursue their work, despite the threats to their safety and their lives. But there are multiple layers of injustice that go beyond the murder of journalists, such as the lack of action from the police that we saw with Martin O'Hagan's murder, and the multiple obstructions in the fight for justice that allow our colleagues' lives to be taken with impunity in some cases. It emboldens those who will go to any lengths to conduct their business in the shadows. We're still seeing an increase in hostility towards journalists. There's a pattern that's been escalating for a long time. And the causes are multifaceted and so complex. But essentially, we're seeing an erosion of trust in journalism. We're seeing the proliferation of disinformation and misinformation, especially through social media. And we know that the majority of young people now get most of their news from social media platforms like TikTok. And on top of that, the conversations that we're having in the context of artificial intelligence demonstrate just how easy it is to manipulate information, manipulate people's perceptions to the extent that genuine reports and images or footage are accused of being propaganda or of being manipulated. But then disinformation and conspiracy is held up as the truth and spreads, as the saying goes, faster than the truth can put its boots on. But where does that disconnect come from in people's brains? Where journalists are being seen as the enemy by the public, as well as the enemy of those in power who don't wish to be scrutinised. And we need to support people to understand that without us, they don't have their freedoms. And it's our job to witness the world and to report on it. And we do that for everybody. And without the work that we do, we don't have a functioning democracy, and we would have no means to hold those in power to account. we wouldn't have access to the insights and the information that tells us what decisions are being taken that affect our lives. And without journalists, none of us have a voice. On International Workers' Memorial Day in April, we make a point of remembering the dead and fighting for the living. And we know that nobody's life should be put at risk for doing their job. The NUJ fights every day to protect journalists and journalism, using every lever that we can. And events like this are important in raising awareness of the need for a safer world, as well as taking the time to remember those that we've lost, like Lyra, Martin, and Veronica. Thank you.
That was wonderful. Don't you just wish the public could have heard what Natasha was saying, because and there seems to be a groundswell against journalists at the moment, which is, I believe, very unfair, and I wish they could have heard those words. Father Martin, will you come back to us? The days leading up to Lyra's funeral were filled with press stories, television and radio programs. However, the day itself left a lasting impression on the world. Father Martin, what were your emotions during that service in St. Anne's Cathedral?
Well, I suppose earlier that day we had been to the wake for the final prayers, and I suppose more than anything else, thinking about Lyra's family and the grief for them, because first and foremost, more than anything else, this was a real family bereavement and the whole circumstances. But I suppose as a family, they didn't have the opportunity to be able to grieve in private. And so many families will ask, well, could you give us privacy? It really felt like the whole world was invading this family. And I think there are even people at the wake who had really nothing to do with the family at all, but wanted to be part of this whole scene. So I think that was first and foremost. I suppose just over the previous couple of days, just aware that the funeral was going to be very significant. And I suppose it struck me in many ways that the funeral was a state funeral in everything but name. So I suppose a sense of a certain amount of apprehension, thinking, oh my goodness, this is really something else with the media attention on it. I would want to say I received extremely warm hospitality from St. Anne's Cathedral. Sometimes people will joke and say, oh, here we are, they're in opposition. We're actually not, but there's really good relationships and a real sense of warmth, and that put me very much at my ease.
That was the last thing in people's minds, wasn't it? There'd be any friction between the two.
Yes.
But your words were powerful. I don't think you had rehearsed those. It seemed to come from your very soul.
Well, a couple of things, I suppose. I wasn't expecting the reaction I got. I suppose one thing, I had spoken later on, and I think Nicola brought it out very clearly tonight, the whole desire for justice, the whole need for justice as well. So I wanted to compliment those really brave women in Derry who had put their hands in the red paint, had marked the walls and made it very clear they were in opposition to what had been going on. And I suppose I was very keen to support them. I'd spoken out and called people to bring whatever information they had to the police or whatever way they got it. And I think it's very poignant. Here we are tonight with Nicola still saying, and the family as well, still looking for justice, and they haven't got that as well, etc. So for me, that was the part of the address that I was probably most concerned about. I did not expect the reaction I got, actually, whenever people started applauding.
I think I got the feeling that those top politicians, were embarrassed by what was going around them, you know, and the great feeling there was for justice.
I suppose one of the things I think I have to, and this is probably not publicly known, I would have to pay tribute to a journalist who was directing the camera crews that day. I'm not going to say too much more because I don't really understand what goes on there. But my address had been actually sent to the Church of Ireland, and the Church of Ireland press office was dealing with it. And so my understanding is that one of the BBC journalists had actually read through it, and he picked up immediately the line that got the attention, why in the name of God
that particular line. And so he gave instructions. So if you actually go back and look at it, the camera was at me at a particular stage. Whenever I came to that line, it switched away from me to the people, to the politicians, and the camera crews or the camera people had been directed beforehand for that particular part to focus on the politicians. So I think that played a huge part as well. He did actually, he did show me the camera that was on me at the time, and it's quite embarrassing because there I am biting my lip, because at that stage I'm thinking, now what do I do? I just hadn't, and I wasn't expecting that, and I really sort of lost, and what next? And now, yeah, so a real sense of, I'm actually lost at this stage, so I thought I'll just finish my sentence and continue on.
Your words were very powerful. Do you think they hit home?
What I would say was the power wasn't in my words. I think the power was in the reaction. The power was in the cathedral there that day, and I think the power was in the pictures that were used in the media. So I'm sort of saying, in many ways, I think my words were given a power.
I think you were the inspiration, though, were you not?
What?
You were the inspiration for the reaction. People were wanting to react, weren't they? You gave them the opportunity.
Well, it clearly touched something, and you know, I'm on public record as saying before, I'd obviously talked to a number of people before giving this address because of its significance. And again, I suppose first and foremost I've got to think about a family in front of me before anything else, and yet this was different. So that was very much a part of my thinking process. So I talked to the likes of the Reverend Harold Good, and I'd say to Harold, explain to him the circumstances. So in fact, that question came from Harold, which I might have changed slightly, but it's very much from Harold inspired that question. I think what happened was, I think I really got caught up in the moment. The other thing, Nicola, and I think were you sitting in where we were? I know you're obviously in the front seats there, but I'm conscious for us in the choir where we actually were, we couldn't hear what actually had happened. So I heard virtually nothing. I didn't hear any of the addresses. I didn't hear the reading. I could hardly hear the music because of whatever way they had changed the speakers. And obviously they were streaming the service as well. So I came in not having any context to it at all. And I think possibly just the emotion of the moment took over at that stage. It's only afterwards when I listened back to it that I think, gosh, I was really frustrated at that stage. So, and I think that's maybe just a little bit of the background as well.
It's been said you were absolutely furious.
Well, yeah, I know people have said to me things like it felt like here was the politicians in the headmaster's office or something like that, but that was not the intentions of the words.
It's fascinating to get your insight.
And just when I'm talking, one of the things that I would like to sort of mention tonight, talking about Lyra, was my first encounter. Alison talked about earlier on about the sense of this young girl. So when I see Lyra for the first time, she comes over to the parish house in St. John's, and I think, oh my goodness, you're just so young. She came over to talk to me about the story of two boys, Thomas Spence, age 11, John Rogers, age 13. And I want to mention this for a particular reason, and please note the date is really important. So I'd heard nothing about them at all. Their story had got lost, but not to Lyra. And that whole sense of, I found in the course of the conversation in the hour, I thought, I really must help Lyra with what she wanted to do, because she wanted to find those boys. And so I do want to say, we're on the 1st of November, 26th of November, 1974, was the day when those two boys disappeared, and we haven't heard of them since. Lyra was so determined. I think from her own words, we heard about the sense of those calls. No stone was literally going to be unturned. She wanted to turn over every stone, literally, to find them. And so I'm going to say here, to use this opportunity to say, wouldn't it be incredible if by the time of the 50th anniversary of their disappearance next year on the 26th of November, progress could be made with that. And I know I've been on the phone to Nicola saying, Nicola, any chance I've been able to take up where she'd left off, etc., etc. But I am going to say it again. What a way what a testament, what a way to mark Lyra's memory, to do something about those two boys.
Thank you. Madam Commissioner, you have a special interest in the safety of journalists, obviously, but it's not easy, especially at this time of unrest. Where do we go from here?
Please call me Dunya. I feel, even though I'm on this enormous screen, which I'm not very happy about, I feel as a part of you know, the group, the family, and all of us trying to remember Lyra. When it comes to your question, I always said that, you know, if journalists cannot work freely and safely, it becomes even more difficult to unearth human rights violations, corruption, or the misuse of power. And the public receives less and less information than it needs to actively take part in the decision-making process. And what happens, you know, then the undemocratic forces thrive. And we have so many examples where all these murders, attacks on journalists, their families, the impunity, created actually an atmosphere that is really difficult to repair or to go back to some better time. What I would like to mention is, you know, actually the fact that my work, when I started my career and started looking at the issues related to journalism, safety of journalists, the importance of you know, the written and you know, words and investigative, courageous journalism, I was mainly looking at the states that are undemocratic states, states like Russian Federation. I was calling for the investigation of dozens of journalists that have been killed in the past decades, from Politkovskaya, Shekochikin, you know, many amazing people that were actually killed because of the work they did, because of the words they wrote, and because of issues they were trying to raise in order to warn about wrongdoings of the governments. But nowadays, and in the past years, what worries me is that even parts of the world that were considered safe places for journalists, EU member states, are in a different situation. And it is very much related to Daphne Caruana Galizia's murder, or assassination, I would say rather, Jan Kuciak and his fiancée, and of course, Lyra McKee, that actually made it even more dangerous to be a journalist in Europe. Where do we go from here is difficult to say. But what I can only say is that we should never give up or give in, even though for me as a, you know, international official, even though I'm not really a usual sort of bureaucrat, and I'm really glad it's like that, because I can simply not put any sugar on the diplomatic you know, language that is used when we talk about people that have been murdered. And then, you know, when you meet the families and you try to understand what happened, and what is expected from the state is what the state should be doing, and that's investigating the wrongdoings. The police, the judiciary, they must be able to investigate all cases of violence against journalists, including those involving state agents. So if we are not able to deliver this to the citizens in democratic states, what can you expect then in other parts of the world? So this toxic atmosphere, you know, it poisons democracy, it poisons society, And any attacks on journalists, on human rights defenders, on activists, on people that want their voices to be heard, whether we are talking about prominent investigative reporters or precarious freelancers, always go beyond the individual case. And what I think is important, it concerns us all. If we manage to understand this importance, that this is not just about one person or one family, it is all of us that suffer. And that's why I think it's extremely important to continue talking about this. But again, this is not going to bring Lyra back, and we know it. But justice, the rule of law, human rights, democracy, it is important. It is the only way forward, and that is why we should never give up. But at the same time, I think it's extremely difficult for Nicola, for Mary, for the family, for all people that care, for all people that contributed to memory of this wonderful human being. I think really, should never lose hope. And that's why I think, we should, apart from remembering Lyra, also celebrate journalism, journalists for the future, because I do not think, we can survive or humanity can survive if journalism is in a way pushed under the carpet, like many would like to see.
Thank you. Nicola, you said surely something would come out of that day when all those influential people gathered under one roof. Can you say anything positive did come out of that day?
Well, actually, no, not really. I mean, that was in April, and politicians had given us all assurances that that they would redouble their efforts in order to go back to work in Stormont. And nothing happened in June, and nothing happened in July, and nothing happened in August. And by September then, our family were like, hold on a minute. You have made promises on the back of Lyra's murder, and you haven't bothered to keep these promises. We're not having that. So we actually started a campaign, a peace campaign, but directed at getting the politicians back into Stormont to get them to actually take part in democracy for everyone. It was connected to what Father Martin said, about anarchy and there being a vacuum being created by the lack of stability and political stability. And so we did launch a campaign, and we wrote to absolutely everyone. We had postcards made. We posted them to every British MP, every MLA, even though they weren't working, every Belfast council representative, hoping they would get to where they needed to be. I wrote to the Queen of England, I wrote to the Taoiseach, I wrote to the Taoiseach, I wrote to the Secretary of State, the Chief Constable, anyone I thought that could possibly make a difference and get these people to actually, for once, fulfill a promise made. Because they made 3 promises to us when the Good Friday Agreement was sold to us: peace, prosperity, and the third one was that your children will be safe now. And we didn't have peace, and we didn't have prosperity, and our child wasn't safe, and neither was anyone else's child. So it was very, very, very important to us. And so we did that. And we did get responses from everyone: Boris Johnson, the Queen, the Taoiseach, Taoiseach. We met the Taoiseach, we met the Secretary Julian Smith at the time. And Yeah, they gave us assurances that they would do whatever they could to bring things forward. And so talks did begin later in the autumn. And then I think it was January, New Decade, New Approach ended up being negotiated through Julian Smith and Simon Coveney and with the local politicians. And they went back to work for a little while. But of course, they've been out of work for a long while. They're out of it longer than they were in it, basically. And that's just not good enough, because you see the same situations arising and occurring. And how can you possibly promise safety to journalists, to nurses, to doctors, to young people, to anyone, when in actual fact you can't even work with each other to do the basic things expected in a democracy? So at the time, we were hopeful that potentially some change would happen. But we just see in Northern Ireland the sad, sad rehashing of the past. History never repeats itself, but it rhymes. And it just rhymes and rhymes and rhymes over. And it's really, really upsetting. When New Decade, New Approach was presented to the world by Simon Coveney, he quoted Lyra on Stormont Hill. And my mummy was lying very sick in hospital. And I showed her the video of Simon Coveney and Julian Smith and New Decade, New Approach, and the politicians were going to get back to work. And my mummy was crying. She started crying, and she just looked at me and she said, "My Lyra did that."
You would like to quote a few words from Lyra, wouldn't you?
Do you know, because of this being the UN International Day of Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, I thought back to a piece of writing that Lyra had done in response to the assassination of a young investigative journalist from Mexico in June 2013 called Jamie Guadalupe Gonzalez Dominguez. And Lyra wrote on this on her blog in The Muckraker. And she wrote, "Every time I tweet news like this, I say it could happen to any of us. Really, what I'm thinking is it could happen to me. And I know others are thinking the same thing. I'm working on a story that requires me to ask questions about dangerous people. Every day, I wonder if they're going to find out and do something about it. When I walk to the shop at night, I keep one eye on the road in case a car slows down. Parked cars make me nervous, as do men in hoodies. I rehearse the moment in my head, escaping as bullets whiz past, hiding behind a hedge and firing back with an imaginary gun that I do not own. I know that if that happens, it won't go down like that. It'll happen quickly, and I will either live or die. In reality, my fears are probably groundless, so I tell myself. I know these people have killed before. I pray that they won't kill a journalist. That doing so would raise too many questions, that they're smarter than that. Yet, if they did, how would my community react? What would they do about it? Would they tweet, "So sad, could happen to any of us"? Or would they actually do something? And they were Lyra's words. When I read these the other day, I actually thought about answering those questions for Lyra. I want her to know what her community did. So I've written her a letter, and I want to share it with you all tonight. Dear Lyra, sweetheart, in the end, the men in hoodies did turn up, but you didn't have a chance to escape as bullets whizzed past. You didn't have a chance to pull out an imaginary gun that you did not own to defend yourself. The bullet didn't whiz past you like you imagined it would, and our world became a darker place in an instant. The gunman who did this, who stole you from us, continues to evade justice. But your community of international journalists did step up, and they didn't just tweet. Your face became front page news, love, the headline story on international television news channels. We couldn't watch the TV for weeks. You're included in international documentaries, and you finally got a story in the New Yorker like you always wanted. But Susan wrote it about you. Ruth, Gail, Suzanne, and some of your other friends and colleagues wrote beautiful tributes in the Beltel and other papers that used to publish your work. I now know so many journalists who I can rely on if we need a story out about your news. Sadly, though, I've also had to fight with a fair few too, and some writers at one of the local rags, which will remain nameless, continued to live up to their reputations that you told me about. But I'll say no more about that. Oh, Lyra, you must know that you received the Journalist Charity Award for your outstanding commitment and dedication to journalism at the Regional Press Awards. Mum and I accepted it on your behalf. And you graduated with a master's degree in journalism from the University of Birmingham. Mum was in hospital. She couldn't go to your graduation. But the university now have an annual lecture in your name. Angels with Blue Faces and Some of Lost Boys was published. And James and Marina from the Centre of Investigative Journalists set up the Lyra McKee Bursary to help disadvantaged journalists to access training, the kind of training you managed to fund for yourself somehow. So far, over 70 journalists have received training, and almost 30 have benefited from one-to-one mentoring to help them to succeed in the career that you loved. They're all Lyra McKee graduates, and I think you'd love that, pet. I know that this is already so hard to believe, but Reporters Sans Frontières also included you in the Journalist Memorial Garden in Bayeux. Your name, the one that I gave you when you were born, is imprinted on a standing stone with the names of other fallen journalists. Mum sent Niall and Kieran to represent us because she couldn't go. She wasn't well. They said it's beautiful there, and maybe one day we'll go. Time's moved on now, love, and Susan is the Press Ombudsman of Ireland now. And her office are launching a bursary in your name, funded alongside a few Irish universities. This will allow a disadvantaged student to access a master's degree in journalism every year, and will open up doors for them that were once shut closed by circumstance, the ones that you kicked in with your own determination. Honestly, love, you'd be amazed at the numbers of young people you have inspired to write and to share their writing with the world. Eamon Baker from Towards Understanding and Healing ran a competition that was inclusive to all communities, all ages and all people, creative writers and journalists. A book was even printed with their entries. Miss McQuaid and Mrs. Deasley from your old primary school, Holy Family, set up the Lyra McKee Young Writer Award. Ava and Laura were so honoured to have awarded it this year. Lyra, we are so proud of you. And I just know that you would have been so proud of all these writers' achievements and so proud that you were the one to inspire them. And it doesn't even end there. Love, just lately, One Young World presented the very first Lyra McKee Award for Bravery in Belfast. Young people from over 200 countries were present in the waterfront that day. You'd have been buzzing. The award went to a young journalist of the year called Abraham Jimenez Enoa from Cuba, who has been exiled to Spain for reporting truths and using his voice to demand justice for others. He reminded me of you. He spoke the truth too, even though it got him into trouble. I think you'd have liked him. I truly wish you could have met him too. Although I know I'm probably leaving something out, Lyra, you know, my old mind isn't what it used to be. I do hope I've covered most things. But in case I haven't, I'm going to just call this the highlights. But before I go, I have to tell you that Ali's film about you has been almost around the world and back again. People as far away as India, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and America know your name and have been inspired by you, love, because of the incredible work of the amazing team at Erica Starling Productions. Lyra, I swear to God, you've literally stolen the hearts of minds of people all over the world, even President Clinton. On top of earning a wide range of awards, including the Tim Hetherington Award for Journalism and the Prix Europa 2023 for Best Documentary, Ali's documentary has helped us to enable you to continue to try to change the world through your own words. She's as talented as you always said she was, love. Maybe even a bit too talented, if the truth be told. Because sometimes when I watch the film, I feel like you're still here. That's just how powerful it is, love. One last thing, Lyra. I'm talking to you from the inaugural Lyra McKee lecture set up by your friends in the National Union of Journalists, including Catherine, Anne, Seamus, and Natasha. On top of everything else that the community of journalists have done, the NUJ want to make sure that you're always remembered and honoured as one of their own, even after we are all gone. For this, we are so very grateful. And I know, Lyra, that you'd be really touched too, if not even just a wee bit scundered by all the attention. And although with every breath, we still wish you could come bouncing in that door, any door, and I'd swap places with you in a heartbeat, love. I also know that nothing anyone will ever do can ever make that happen. They couldn't even do that in the magical world of Harry Potter that you love so much. But in answer to your question, Lyra, that you asked in 2013, when Jamie Dominguez was murdered in Mexico, how would my community react if it happened to me? Well, we love. I think you can see now that your community continues to stand with you. Your community continues to help you shine your light into a world that has been shadowed with great darkness since you were stolen from us. And your community will never, ever let you be forgotten. Between them all, they've ensured that you have a lasting legacy that we are so proud of, just like we are so proud of you. God bless you, baby sister. Tell Mum we miss and love her terribly too. Life's pretty shit without you both. Sorry, Father Martin. Love you always, your Ikawa.
Wow.
Please don't. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Well, what can you say? Finally, Alison, what do you think Lyra would have made of this evening?
Well, thanks for the tissue, and sorry about your tie, Seamus. Nicola, that's amazing. What would she have made? She probably would have said, wouldn't she, Nicola? Can you hear it now? Can you believe it? Can you believe everybody's talking about me? Can you believe it? She'd be pulling and pulling and pulling his shoulder. I think Dara's sitting back at the back. He remembers his shirt being pulled to pieces every time we went for that large hot chocolate with 16 tons of marshmallows and extra whipped cream. I think she'd have been really honoured, and I think also not forgetting that her message was always about, you know, don't ever let anybody say you can't do this. What is it, Nicola? Don't let anyone. Last clip of the film we were trying to play, but we couldn't manage to get it to go. What is it? Don't.
It says, don't fucking listen to the naysayers and the bullshitters.
If you want to do it, you go do it, and don't let anyone tell you that you can't. And it was a message of like, go on. And everywhere we've played that film, we've had young people go, I'm going to do it. So there's a real inspirational get up and do it. And it is a hard world and a tough place. But I think her message of hope and inspiration is what makes, you know, it just touches people, because she was so fiery like that. Brilliant.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we were aiming to finish about 9:30. It's now 9:30. We also wanted to go into the audience to ask you if you would like to say anything, ask questions or make a comment. So we are allowed to go on if we wish. Before we take a few comments from the audience, I've got one, Seamus, that came from an audience member. But I'll just tell you a quick story. 64 years ago yesterday, Ulster Television went on air for the first time. And early on, there was an interview in the studio conducted by Ivan Mills, some of you will remember, with a well-known businessman from Belfast and his secretary. And the subject was dictaphones. Excuse me, it's been an emotional night. And Ivor said to the boss, well, you know, this is pretty good for you. You dictate all your messages, all your letters. Just give it to your secretary and she'll type it up. And he said to the secretary, that's not so good for you. This could make you redundant. And quick as a flash, this very attractive woman stood up. She walked across. She sat on Ivor's knee. She took his face in her hands and she kissed him long and passionately. And then she turned to the camera. This was all live. And she said, a dictaphone can't do that. So Seamus, is AI going to make journalists redundant?
I don't think it will make journalists redundant, but it will actually change the nature of work. But I think we can, you know, and you can sound like, you know, the blacksmith objecting to the introduction of the motor car when you start raising questions. I think there are clear benefits in relation to artificial intelligence. Generative AI is another issue, but I think there are things that AI can't do. AI couldn't have written what we've just heard here tonight. AI cannot tell a story. AI, in my view, has to have, in order to be anyway useful, it has to be informed by the human mind and by the creative instinct. But there are real concerns about it, and I have to warn you that I spoke for 45 minutes at the Markovic lecture on this recently, so I'm not going to rehearse all of that. But what I would say to you is that there is a need for, I think, UNESCO as the appropriate authority to look at how it impacts on journalism, but also there is a need for a convention of the ILO to look at how it impacts on the workplace. And there is a particular gender dimension to this, particularly in the developing world, because those who invent technology say it's going to get rid of menial tasks. A lot of those menial tasks in media organisations and in administrative functions are carried out by low-paid women workers. And they're the people who are going to be suffering as a result of that. So there is a gender dimension to it. On a lighter note, in looking at my archives recently in the Independent or NUJ archives, we came across the emerging technology in the NUJ, which was going to change the life of journalism. And that was the introduction of a thing called the fax machine. And they were going to put a fax machine in the Oireachtas in Leinster House, which meant that you were no longer going to have the women who say copy and you phone in the copy. So the NUJ said, well, we think this could be very good and very useful, but on the other hand, we don't want to put copywriters out. So we found a great industrial relations solution to it. We did an agreement where we got paid extra for the introduction of the fax machine, but we agreed it wouldn't be plugged in.
Thank you. Would anybody in our audience wish to say anything, make any comments? Louis McConnell.
I'm Louis McConnell. Can I sit down? I had a fall lately. One point I wanted to point out, put it that way, is that 3 journalists died in Northern Ireland. Dozens and dozens of us were also threatened in this same way as someone who had knocked it off. People can think about that. We should never forget the people who are threatened. I was threatened. My wife was threatened. I lost my parents' home in Springfield Road long ago. I'm not listing a whole lot of miseries, but the threats are still there. And I'm sure those people, those journalists who appear every night on your television have been threatened one way or another. That's simply all I want. It's just a thought.
Thank you, Louis. Catherine, I know you knew Lyra very well, very, very close to her.
Yeah, and I just wanted to say very, very briefly, I was the person who nominated Lyra for membership of the NUJ. I was deeply, deeply fond of her, and I've known her since she was 16, like Alison. And she was some pup, I'll tell you that. But I remember writing something about her after she died. And she'd written a foreword to a book of essays by a guy called Kieran McCart, a researcher, a campaigner. It was victim stories. And in her foreword to it, she says, every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. So does this one. It can be summarized as a bullet, and a bullet. When I rang Kieran for permission to use that, he said, the story of Lyra McKee will not end with that bullet. Her family and friends will see to that, and so will the NUJ. And I'm so glad that we're all here tonight honouring her memory as a dear colleague. And I was very touched by what Nicola and Father Martin and Alison and Seamus said. And particularly when Seamus was talking about AI, there were some things that Lyra McKee did that AI could not have managed. One of them was she had the dirtiest laugh I've ever heard. And the second one was shortly before she died, when she'd moved up to Derry to live with her partner, Sarah Canning. She dressed up as a nun and took a photograph of herself drinking a pint. And she tweeted it to Father Martin with the pint, the wee innocent face of her. And she says, do you need a hand saying Mass tomorrow, Father? And that was, you'll not get AI to do that. But she'll long be remembered.
Thank you, Catherine. Well, if nobody else really, we've enjoyed and taken in everything. And our leading lady tonight was known as being kind and funny and a trailblazer who loved hugging people and believed in total tolerance. When she was 24, Lyra wrote a letter to her 14-year-old self about being gay, a future in journalism, and being happy. Despite the ups and downs of her teenage life, she finished with these words we could do well to reflect on. Keep hanging on, kid. It won't always be like this. It's going to get better. I love you. Thank you for being part of tonight's wonderful event. So emotional, stimulating, and a pleasure. Thank you to the panel. Thank you to Dunja and Natasha. And I hope you all enjoyed this evening and will take away a lot from it.
Yeah.
Seamus.
Just before we go, I think it would be appropriate that we would acknowledge the work of Belfast and District Branch in putting this programme together. The definition of a styline is grace under pressure, so you have it in bucketfuls. This has been a really difficult programme to put together. I know the work that's been involved, the cancellation through unavoidable circumstances of the last minute of Susan, the notion of putting together a programme of people contributing in all directions was an enormous challenge, and I just think on everyone's behalf I want to acknowledge the work of Anne and the team. I'm not going to mention anyone in particular, that you know who you are, and to just say that I think between Susan McKee and Father Martin, you already have the programme for next year. The two boys and Susan McKay's lecture, your work's done. Good, just put the programme together. Thank you very much.